Hello, everyone. Just some people joining now. Welcome to this webinar. We'll get started in a couple of minutes once some more people have filtered in. People just joining. If you're just joining, please say hello in the chat box. Say where you're watching from today. Maybe it's late enough in the day that you can even justify enjoying a glass of wine. So if so, please say what you're drinking. Hopefully it's Argentinian. If not, no problem at all. Hi guys, got Sopot, Mallorca. Wish I was in Mallorca right now. Switzerland, Stitches. Very nice. From Turkey. Amazing. Berlin. Lots of people from Spain today. That's fantastic. Someone from Oman. Welcome. Tarragona. Wow, the people from Spain are really representing. Well done, guys. All right. Well, I think we should get started off. Welcome to this webinar on Argentina's main wine regions. My name is Sam Povey. I am an educator at the Wine and Spirit Education Trust School, London, and I'm delighted to be hosting this webinar on behalf of WSET Global, who, as I'm sure you know, are the world's leading provider of qualifications in courses in wines, spirits, sake, and beer as well. This webinar is going to be recorded and will be available to watch shortly after the webinar is finished on the WSET Global Events Hub on YouTube. If you have questions at any point during the webinar, can you please put them in the Q&A box? So not in the chat, but in the Q&A box. And I'll do everything I can to get to those questions toward the end of this 30 minutes. But let's get started. Let's kick off. So Charlotte, if we could go to the next slide, please. We're going to start off today with a little bit of very, very brief history on Argentina. We're then going to look at the main grape varieties before talking about the most important wine producing regions. So the grapevine is not native to South America. Grapevines were brought over by European colonists, and in the case of Argentina, specifically Spanish colonists, in the 16th century. So in 1551, the first vines are introduced to the country, and the main reason for that is to ensure that they had wine for mass, for Catholic mass. So that was the original kind of reason why these were introduced, and it wasn't really until 300 years later, so in the 19th century, that we see wine production become commercial. So the production of wine specifically for sale, initially within Argentina itself. And this is supported by the continued arrival of European immigrants, often from wine-producing regions, who brought with them the skills and expertise needed to expand the wine-producing sector. And also the introduction of helpful pieces of infrastructure like railway, which in a country as large as Argentina is very important, not only for getting equipment to wineries, but for getting wine to the places where people drink it. It's around about this time as well, in the 1850s or so, that we see Malbec brought over for the first time. We lack a precise date, although lots of people refer to the arrival of a French viticulturalist called Michel Aimé Puget, I hope I pronounced that correctly, who was a major figure in the expansion and the improvement of viticulture in Argentina, and is often credited with introducing the Malbec grape variety to the country. Fast forward just a little bit. So Argentina has been producing a fair amount of wine, but mainly for domestic consumption. But unfortunately, the 1970s brings quite a lot of economic turmoil within Argentina, and at the same time, a rise in the popularity of beer and soft drinks, which compete with wine for domestic consumption. And so as a result, the winemakers of Argentina are searching around for a solution with what to do with all of their wine. And they set upon, as many wine regions eventually do, on the answer of let's export the wine to the rest of the world. Now, quite a lot is needed to change about the industry in order to successfully export the wine, particularly an improvement in quality to be competitive against what is being exported elsewhere. And in the 1990s, there's quite a bit of economic liberalization in Argentina, which Number one, makes it easier to invest in the country, so the country opens itself to foreign investment. And amongst the many industries that benefit from this, wine is one of them. So we see lots of new equipment, lots of new expertise coming into the Argentine wine industry in the 1990s. And at the same time, you see Argentina sign trade agreements, which makes it easier to export the wines themselves. And the impact of this is quite clearly seen in the numbers. So if we go back to 1993, there are only 10 wineries in Argentina that are exporting wine, only 10. As of 2021, that number is over 520. So from 10 in 1993 to over 520 nowadays is a major, major increase. Back in 1993, only 2% of Argentine wine was exported. Now it's 25% is exported. So the industry has changed massively, even in the last 30 years, to produce the wines that we know and love today. Now let's talk a little bit about the grape varieties themselves. Overall in Argentina, we have, roughly speaking, 214,000 hectares of vineyards. Put that into context, Australia has about 170,000 hectares. So an extra kind of 40,000 hectares or so planted in Argentina. 214,000 hectares is roughly equivalent to the total hectareage of the Languedoc, which is the world's largest wine producing region, for example. In terms of what is planted, the most important grape variety is Malbec. That makes up 23% of vineyard plantings throughout Argentina. So basically 1 in every 4 hectares of vines is Malbec. This is a fascinating grape variety. It's originally from the southwest of France and was almost entirely wiped out in France in a massive frost in 1956. In any case, besides that, it didn't ripen particularly well in its homeland because it needs quite a bit of sunlight and quite a bit of warmth. So the fact that it was taken over to Argentina was very, very lucky for Malbec indeed, because it absolutely thrives in these growing conditions. Charlotte, if we could go to the next slide. Fantastic. So as I said, Malbec really thrives with the warmth and the sunlight that we'll discuss in a little bit. Bernarda is the next most widely planted black grape variety. Bernarda makes up about 9%, so about half as much as Malbec. This is a grape variety that in the past has not been associated with the highest level of quality. However, we are beginning to see some more interesting examples being produced. Bernarda has much lower tannin than Malbec, tends to produce a wine that is slightly lighter embodied with lots of cherry, blueberry, plum, and sometimes slightly floral aromas compared to Malbec, which has a much deeper, slightly more brooding character and particularly high tannins. In terms of other black varieties planted, we see a significant amount of Cabernet Sauvignon being planted as well, as we do see with Syrah as well. And in certain areas, just a tiny bit of Pinot Noir, about 1% of the country's vineyards are Pinot Noir. In terms of white grape varieties, the most widely planted is a grape called Pedro Ximénez with a G, so spelled like Pedro Jimenez, but with a G, Pedro Ximénez. And this bears no relation to Pedro Jimenez whatsoever. It's a high-yielding variety. It's almost entirely used for domestic consumption, so it's something that you're unlikely to see outside of Argentina. But a grape variety, a white grape variety, you're much more likely to see is Torrontés, which has become a little bit of a specialty of Argentina. About 5% of Argentina's vineyards are planted with Torrontés. And it has this incredibly aromatic character. So if you think of grapes like Muscat or Viognier, for example, even Gewürztraminer, it has this incredibly floral quality. So you get aromas like rose petal, honeysuckle, blossom, with a slightly oily, sometimes people describe it as a little bit soapy texture. You are also seeing this blended with grape varieties like Sauvignon Blanc, which is lesser planted in Argentina as well. You may also in Argentina come across Chardonnay and a little bit of Chenin Blanc in certain areas. And then the final grape variety to mention here are the Criolla grapes. So the Criolla grapes are a collective term for the ancestors, or sorry, I should say the children of grape vines that were planted very early on in the history of Argentina's wine production. So these were planted from seeds taken mainly from Spain, particularly places like the Canary Islands. And as many of you well know, if you plant a seed that has been produced by a grapevine, you get an entirely new grape variety because it has the genetic makeup of two different grapevines. And so it becomes its own grape variety. And the Criollo grapes are essentially clones of some of the grapevines that were planted using seeds that were brought over from Europe. So these are different from their parents. There are two particularly important Criollo grapes. The first is called Cereza, which I believe translates to cherry. And I think that really refers to the kind of pinky color of the grapes themselves. Again, in the past, grapes like Cereza and also Criollo Chica, which is also known as Pais in Chile, across the Andes, were used to produce really high volumes of probably not the world's most exciting wines, but that is changing. And particularly in a wine market where lighter, more delicate styles of red wine with lower tannins, even styles of red that you can chill slightly, a bit that these styles are becoming increasingly popular. Criollo is being rediscovered, particularly by the country's younger winemakers, and being used to produce some really interesting styles. I've only tried one wine from Criollo grapes in the UK, but I have to say it's absolutely lovely. So please do not write these grape varieties off. Charlotte, if we could go to the next slide. So we're going to get into the main wine producing regions in Argentina. This is a handy map on the right-hand side here. So we're going to start all the way up in the north in the province of Salta, and we're going to go down north to south. So we'll go to La Rioja, and then San Juan, into Mendoza, and then finish off in Patagonia. That takes us on a journey of 1,500 kilometers north to south. And Argentina is home to some of the most extreme vineyards in the world. Extreme in that they are very low, some of them at very low latitudes. So if you have a look right up there in Salta, you're up to almost 25 degrees south of the equator, which is well beyond where we could usually produce vines. But the other produce grapes. But the other reason that we're able to practice viticulture successfully in an area this extreme is because of the altitudes. So a lot, as you can see from that map there, most of the regions of Argentina are based in the foothills of the Andes. And you'll find most of Argentina's vineyards somewhere between 600 and 2,000 meters above sea level. And what that means is that while during the day it is baking hot and there is extremely intense sunlight, the temperatures at night are significantly lower. And as a result of that, you can still produce balanced wine with plenty of acidity and lots of powerful, intense fruit aromas. Other factors that bind these different wine producing regions together are the fact that rainfall is very low. So Argentina's vineyards, they sit in the rain shadow of the Andes. The Andes shield these vineyards from any Pacific influence that might bring a little bit of rain. And that means that irrigation is essential for producing much of these wines. So they're often irrigated using aquifers, so drilling down into the water table, or in certain regions like Mendoza, actually taking irrigation water from rivers that are fed by meltwater from the Andes themselves. Okay, Charlotte, if we could go to the next slide, let's have a look at Salta first. So we're all the way up at the very, very top of the map here. In green, you can see Salta, and specifically the main department of Salta is called Cafayate. This is the same distance from the equator as Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, just to give you an idea of how close we are to the equator. And viticulture would not be possible here were it not for the extremely high altitudes that we see at many of these vineyards. The vineyard that is pictured here is the Colume estate, which is home to the world's second tallest vineyard at 3,111 meters above sea level. There is one vineyard that is higher, and you find that in Tibet, to give you just an idea of how high in altitude we are. So many of the vineyards are above 3,000 meters in Cafayate. Daytime temperatures go up to about 37 degrees, but they plunge down to 12 degrees at night. And by doing so, we slow down the ripening of the grapes and we ensure that the wines that we produce have beautiful acidity to balance out quite rich flavors and fairly high levels of alcohol. The specialty of Cafayate is Torontes, that white grape variety that makes this extraordinarily floral, aromatic wine. But you'll also see black grape varieties like Malbec and Cabernet Sauvignon planted as well, which, while they may have high levels of alcohol, also have lovely, pronounced, fresh acidity for balance. All right, if we move to the next slide, please, Charlotte. We go down to an area that is slightly confusingly known as La Rioja. So nothing to do with Rioja in Spain, takes the same name. The wines have to be labeled La Rioja Argentina, just to avoid confusion if you're importing them into the European Union. And most of the wine produced in La Rioja is in the Famatina Valley, and this is an area that specializes traditionally in high volume production. So they make quite a lot of Torontes, maybe not with quite the same aromatic intensity as Cafayate and Salta. Also, you'll see a good amount of Cabernet Sauvignon, Syrah, and a little bit of Bernarda, that other black grape variety that produces a more medium-bodied, slightly lower tannin red wine compared to Malbec. Hi, Vanessa from Mendoza. We'll be coming to Mendoza very shortly. Charlotte, if we could go to the next slide, please. So our next slide takes us just a little bit further south to the area highlighted in aquamarine. This is San Juan. This is the second largest wine producing region after Mendoza. There's quite a variation in altitude. So the lower vineyards are planted at about 450 meters. I say the lower vineyards, 450 meters is at a higher altitude than most of the world's vineyards, and all the way up to about 1,400 meters above sea level. By the way, a useful kind of tip to keep in mind is that for every 100 meters you go up in altitude, the average daily temperature falls by about half a degree. So 1,000 meters would mean 5 degrees lower temperature on average. So big difference. Syrah is one of the specialties of San Juan. The Syrah that's produced here fits somewhere between those really full-bodied, slightly stewed Aussie Shirazes that you might see, and the slightly fresher, lighter-bodied styles that you might see in France. Most of the producers use the word Syrah on their bottles rather than Shiraz, even though they are the same grape variety, and I think that's a nod towards that style with higher levels of acidity that many producers are going for and is quite popular at the moment. Of course, we see Malbec produced in San Juan, along with Cabernet Sauvignon and Bernarda. These grape varieties may very well be produced as a varietal wine, so you might just see Syrah or just see Malbec, but they're quite often blended as well, and that's something that producers are playing around with quite a lot. So you might see a wine with 75% Syrah and the rest a variety of accessory varieties, maybe a bit of Malbec, maybe a bit of Cabernet Sauvignon blended in as well. The winemakers here have quite a lot of freedom to do what they will. In terms of white grapes, we see Torontes, of course, and a little bit of Chardonnay produced here as well. Next slide, please, Charlotte. And we move on to the main event, Mendoza, the largest wine producing region in Argentina. Mendoza itself is divided into about 4 or 5 different areas. So this is purple on the map. The north and eastern areas of Mendoza are the regions that produce the highest volumes of wine, particularly of Malbec. These are irrigated with water that comes off the Mendoza River, and you've got particularly kind of flat vineyards here with reasonably fertile soils, which is perfect for producing large quantities of wine. However, one of the big changes, and again, this has come along as Argentina has reorientated itself toward exports, is the focus on some of its higher altitude sites. So central Mendoza contains two departments, Luján de Cuyo and Maipú. Luján de Cuyo is particularly high altitude. So we see vineyards here between about 900 and 1100 meters above sea level. And this is where old vine Malbec is at its very best. This area produces some of the most elegant, concentrated, and age-worthy examples of the grape variety. Malbec from these regions, when it's young, has this lovely, glossy black fruit flavor with sometimes a slightly violety floral character. And because oak maturation is fairly popular as well, a good whack of vanilla, clove, cedar, sweet baking spices. But with time, you can develop extraordinary complexity in some of these wines. Maipú is at a slightly lower altitude. You see quite a lot of Syrah and Cabernet Sauvignon planted here, as well as old vine Bernarda. So I mentioned earlier, Bernarda, not the best reputation in the past, but where you have old vines, you just get that extra level of concentration to produce a style that has every bit as much intensity and aromatic complexity as Malbec with lower tannins, so it's a little bit more accessible. If we could go to the next slide, please. So staying here in Mendoza, the next department sub-region to mention is the Uco Valley. And the Uco Valley has the highest altitude vineyards within the entire region of Mendoza, up to about 1,500 meters above sea level. Quite a lot of white grapes planted here, Chardonnay and Sauvignon Blanc in particular, as well as being complemented by our Malbec, our Cabernet Sauvignon, as well as a little bit of Merlot and even some Tempranillo as well. Again, commonly blended together, but some absolutely stunning wines from the Uco Valley that you can find. And then finally, we have southern Mendoza. So this is particularly known as this is known in particular as San Rafael. This is among the coolest areas within all of Argentina because we're now significantly further south compared to even the rest of Mendoza. We have got a cooler, longer summers where you see many of the same grape varieties I've mentioned planted, but made with slightly lower bodies, so slightly lower levels of alcohol. The fruit will be a little bit fresher as well. And I think is an area that's becoming increasingly interesting. By the way, the picture you can see here is of irrigation practiced in Mendoza. So one of the things they'll do is they'll dig channels between the rows of vines to funnel that kind of irrigation water to make sure all of the vines get their fill. And finally, if we can move to the next slide, Charlotte. So now we're down in the very south of Argentina in Patagonia. Because of Patagonia's high latitude, so because we're now about sort of 37 degrees north, it is the coolest part of Argentina, and you can see that just by the sort of slide in front of you. There's a lot more greenery being produced here compared to the sort of desert-like conditions that we find in areas like Mendoza, for example. That means that the grape varieties and styles of wine that you see here can be significantly different. So we do still see Malbec and Cabernet Sauvignon and even a little bit of Merlot planted. But of increasing importance are grape varieties like Pinot Noir, which, well, to be honest with you, never tried one myself, are known for being a sort of a fairly elegant style, I suppose similar to something like you might find in Central Otago, for instance. We also have white grapes like Chardonnay and Sauvignon Blanc planted too. So quite a lot of variety. And again, it's that growing environment that supports that variety and diversity of style and quality that we see within the country itself. So Charlotte, if we could go to the final slide. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box. We've got about 5 minutes or so, and I would be happy to answer them. John Brooks has read that I've read that the Catena family were influential in planting Malbec in 1902. John, you're absolutely right, and that's very convenient because on the 6th of December we have a webinar with Dr. Laura Catena, so you can ask her yourself. That's on the 6th of December, and you can find the details of that on the WSET Global events page. So please do have a little look. Bertrand asks, is the economic crisis in Argentina beneficial or not to Argentine wines? Argentina's been through quite a few different economic crises over the last 50 years or so. Generally speaking, economic crisis is not a good thing because it creates uncertainty. And if you're trying to encourage investment, uncertainty is not a good thing. That being said, it has provided opportunities when the Argentine currency has been particularly weak, that you can purchase land at relatively low prices. And that has encouraged the planting of some of Argentina's better known vineyards as well, particularly by large international companies, particularly French companies, and to a lesser extent American ones as well, which has allowed for the diffusion of better technology, better knowledge as well. So there's been a small silver lining amongst what is a fairly large cloud. Thayas asks, usually the oak used in Argentina is used or new French or American. It is a whole range. I know that higher sort of quality producers over the last 30 years have really favored French oak in particular, but you do sometimes see a little bit of American oak used too. In terms of used or new, again, the trend has been towards newer oak for higher quality wines, but that has been reversed in recent years. Generally speaking, you'll see a blend. So, you might see a certain proportion of new oak and then second, third, and fourth fill being used as well. Miguel, any local grape varieties? Absolutely. So we've mentioned a few, Bernarda and Torrontés that you really don't see in many other places, as well as those Criolla grape varieties like Cereza. And I'd argue that while Malbec is not originally from Argentina, it is the iconic style produced in the country. So I think we can include that in our kind of our box of local grape varieties. But as I said at the beginning, the grapevine Vitis vinifera is not, is not indigenous to South America. Romain, what are the main climate-related challenges and opportunities for wine production in Argentina? A fantastic question. This is a region, many of the wine regions here, because of where they are already hot, already sunny, and already dry, and just becoming more so with time. Fortunately, the Argentinians are used to these conditions, so they're very good at making use of the scarce water resources that are there to irrigate in a way that is as efficient as possible. But that is certainly a challenge, is being able to get water in the future. So people are focusing, for example, on looking at old vines, different clonal selections, to find grapes that are a little bit more resistant to drought. Other problems, hail is a major challenge, and that's becoming more frequent, which can be a big problem, particularly in Mendoza. They often use netting to protect the vines. Netting brings its own problems. It's expensive. But fortunately, because we're in Argentina, it's nice and dry, so you don't get problems of fungal disease. Guys, that is around about our time for today. Sorry, I couldn't get to all of your questions. My colleague Charlotte has just put a feedback poll up. If you could answer that quickly, that would be greatly appreciated. But thank you once again for joining this webinar. As I mentioned at the start, a recording of the webinar will be available on the Global WSET Events Hub on YouTube shortly after the end of this session. I also mentioned we've got a couple of webinars coming up. So Dr. Laura Catena, who is part of the Catena family, icons in Argentina, will be discussing Argentina's climate and topography in far more detail than I could possibly muster today. So that's on the 6th of December at 4 p.m. UK time, GMT, 4 p.m. GMT. And then I am back on the 23rd of January to discuss Greece, one of my favorite wine producing countries. And we'll be looking at Greece's main wine producing regions in the new year. So I hope to see you again. But thank you all for joining. Really appreciate it. And have a lovely day. See you all very, very soon indeed. Cheers.